Hello, everybody. This is Jonathan from Mnemonic, and I'm here with Jessica Minhas, who's our Marketing and Communications Director. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, Jonathan. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the webinar session today. And I'm your host, Jessica. That's Jonathan. He's the CEO of Mnemonic, and we are presenting the 4 key types of EHS regulations and how to comply. So just a few points. We will address all the questions that you have at the end, but please feel free to send your questions at any time during the presentation. We will make the recording available on our website later today, but if you would like to receive the webinar link in an email, then please mention that in the post-webinar survey. The survey will be launched as soon as you exit the webinar at any time. The survey also has 2 to 3 other questions to gather your feedback on today's webinar, and we would really appreciate it if you could just take the 30 seconds of your time to fill out the survey. That said, thank you all once again for taking time to join today's session, and it's all over to you, Jonathan.
Great, thanks, Jessica. I'm really excited to do this webinar, and as Jessica mentioned, we would be very happy to receive your comments at the end of the webinar, so please don't hesitate to fill out that survey. If you have questions or if I mentioned something that's maybe a little bit unclear during the presentation, please just pop a question into the chat. So you have a chat that's part of the GoToWebinar system. Just type it in and we'll get to it either during the webinar or shortly afterwards, and we should be done by noon. So my name is Jonathan. I'm the founder and CEO of Mnemonic, and we're really excited to do this webinar today. So I just wanted to share my webcam for a few minutes at the beginning so you get a sense of what I look like, and then I'm going to switch it off and we'll jump into the slides. We've got people from all around the world on this call, EHS managers, regulatory affairs managers, all sorts of people from really fantastic companies that are dealing with very complex operations, high-risk operations. And so I hope this webinar will help reframe a little bit the way that the regulators are regulating. And I'm really keen to get your feedback on this because some of the concepts in this webinar are fairly new, or it's a reframing that's new from last year. And I'm really keen to hear from EHS managers, regulatory affairs people about what they think of this and whether they feel that this is a helpful way to view the regulatory bodies. So let's get started. I'm going to close my webcam so you can have the whole screen for my slides. And Jessica, if there's any sort of technical problems, please let me know. Hopefully everybody should be able to see this, the main slide now with the title of our webinar, which is the 4 key types of regulations and how to comply. And I put in brackets or try. I think we all know that complying to regulations is not easy, especially since the regulations are changing on a regular basis. And there's no magic solution. It's a lot of hard work, a lot of people, and I will hopefully help illustrate a little bit some strategies, tactics, and things to help you comply. All right, let's get started. All right, so just as I mentioned, I'm the CEO of Mnemonic. I'm sitting in Montreal today, sunny, hot day, and I'm an engineer by training, so that take that for what you will, but it obviously influences the way I view the world and the way we build our products here. So I'm an engineer. I worked in the metallurgical industry, steel and gold mining for a while, and saw some pretty complicated high hazard situations, and that's what pushed me to go into EHS about 10 years ago. It goes real fast. And I'm really passionate about world-class compliance and easy to use software. Here at Mnemonic, we believe that if all organizations, all companies and governments respected EHS regulations, there would be far less environmental damage, far less worker injury, far less quality problems. So that's really what we're all about. We're here to help you comply because we believe that if you have a robust, comprehensive compliance program, your workers will be safe, your stakeholders will be protected, and the environment will be in better shape. So, very high level, what's the purpose of a regulation? And we're dealing with regulations every day, but I think it's really good to take a step back and remember, why do regulations exist? And I found this phrase in a report that really encapsulates the raison d'etre, the reason why we have regulations, and it's to incite behavior that would not otherwise occur. if everybody behaved in a way that kept workers safe and protected the environment and produced high quality safe products, there'd be no need for regulations. But of course, we know that's not the case. And so regulations, the goal is to incite behavior that would not otherwise occur. And I hope this webinar will help illustrate the way that governments and regulators are trying to incite behavior. And the motivation, the methods that they use to incite that behavior is really critical to understanding the intent of a regulation. So why do regulation types matter? And I'd say why we wanted to organize this webinar is we want to help you understand the nature of regulation, because that's going to help you understand the intent of the regulator and the key steps to becoming compliant. If you don't understand the nature of something, it's very hard to really wrap your head around it. You end up having this superficial knowledge and you're kind of just following an instruction manual rather than understanding the underlying system. And so today we want to help you try and understand the underlying system that is regulations and relevant other documents. And so we want to also help you comply more easily or better by having a perspective on how the regulators are thinking. It's like in a sports match. If you understand the way your opponent thinks, that helps you inform your game plan. And the goal here is not to help you cheat or to like outmaneuver the regulator, but really to understand what is the regulator trying to do, how are they trying to do it, and therefore how can we best comply. And so that's really the purpose of today's webinar on regulation types. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is based on these two reports. So if you're interested in going into the material in more detail, I really highly recommend these two reports. One that came out last year, Designing Safety Regulations for High Hazard Industries, and the other one that came out earlier this year, Operator Qualification White Paper from the state of New York. Both of these reports are really fascinating. They were both done by committees of very experienced people who are much more experienced than I am, and they're really worth a read. And I wanted to thank a fellow by the name of Ray Lacqua, who runs a compliance company called Lean Compliance out of Toronto. And he's actually the one who brought these reports to my attention. So I believe he might be on the call. A big thank you to Ray. And I do highly recommend picking up these reports. They're available online. You just can Google for them and you'll find them in a PDF format. All right, so agenda for today. We did a brief overview of what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about the 4 key types of regulations. That will be the kind of the meat of today's presentation. We're going to do a bit of a comparison between these types of regulations and then a short case study to illustrate how the regulators are actually putting this into action, I should say. So first, a quick poll. We just want to get a pulse before we start. Have you heard of the terms macro, micro, means, and ends-based regulations? I'm kind of curious. There's a lot of terms out there, but I'm kind of curious to know if people have already heard about this nomenclature, this way of labeling regulations, or is this something that's entirely new for you? So please, I think the poll has been launched, Jessica. So, all right, the results are coming in. Over 70% of people have voted. Thank you. And so interesting, and is that over 80 right now, about 84% of the attendees have not heard of these terms. Only 17% have heard of macro and micro and means and ends-based regulations. So happy to hear that I'm not the only one that learned about this in the last year, and hopefully this will help get you started along the path to reframing the regulatory body. All right, so overview. Some of the challenges that regulators face. Let's just go through these 3 ones. There's of course other ones, but these are the 3 that we picked out. Is that low frequency of catastrophes makes assigning a specific pattern to data challenging. So if you only have a catastrophe, hopefully we only have catastrophes really as rarely as possible, but that low frequency makes it challenging to deduce exactly what caused the catastrophe. And in many cases, each catastrophe is very unique. And so how do you regulate to reduce catastrophes if each catastrophe is unique? And the second big challenge is that complex designs and operations make micro means. So micro means would be, and we'll get into the meat of this, prescriptive, very specific. It's the traditional regulations we're familiar with that dictate the types of personal protective equipment you have to give to your staff, the fire extinguishers, etc. So the very prescriptive stuff that we're used to, complex designs and operations make this approach inadequate. So it's no longer good enough to dictate exactly which personal protective equipment you need to use. You have to go beyond that. And as we all know, operations are getting more complex. Companies are becoming more international. There's just more and more complexity in our operation that makes it challenging to regulate. And I remind everybody at Mnemonic, we're in an office, we have a fairly simple operation, but all of our customers are in very complex operations, and we often forget how complex they are. And we try and get out onto the site to visit everybody as often as possible. And then the third big challenge, that routine features of complex technologies can lead to disasters. And so this was a term coined in 1984 by Charles Perrow called normal accidents, meaning that you can have a well-designed system, you can have risk control, you can have all sorts of stuff in place, but nevertheless, routine things within the context of a complex operation, complex technologies can lead to disaster. There's just so many variables. And so the regulators want to try and improve this, but it's far from easy, and it's unrealistic to imagine that any system is going to be completely immune to failure. So a bit of a high-level change in regulatory design, and this is just one example from the United States where there was the creation of the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, and they put in place an obligation to have a safety and environmental management system for offshore operations. And then PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration, also made management systems a requirement for pipeline operators. So there is a trend, and this one's in the US, but we see similar things in the UK, Norway, Canada, really around the world, where regulators are moving away from prescriptive, very detail-oriented regulations and forcing organizations to implement management systems, safety, environmental, risk. And so this is a general trend we're seeing all around the world, and that companies are sometimes struggling to meet. Oops, sorry, one too quick. So what are some of the challenges and the results of the change in this design? We're moving away from prescriptive towards more management system-based requirements. One thing is it's more difficult to ascertain, to determine the effectiveness of the regulatory design, just because when you abstract away and you're no longer evaluating, does this company have the right valve in place, does it have the right PPE in place, and is your management system operating properly? That's a much more complex question, a much more difficult question to determine. And then effectiveness of regulations, regardless of operations, is challenging. So determining whether or not the regulations are effective across a variety of operations, different companies, different groups, different environments, it becomes very challenging to do this. Also, even if there is an incident at a workplace, at an operation, that's not necessarily indicative of a regulatory failure. The regulations can be robust, they can be very good, and you can still have an incident for a variety of other reasons that fall outside the scope of what regulations can ever achieve. And then even if you don't have incidents, a lengthy period without incidents is also not an indicator of effectiveness. So if we put this all together, we're kind of saying with these management-based systems that are abstracted away, that are less prescriptive, it becomes very difficult to determine the effectiveness of the regulations. And if you want to dive into this in a little bit more detail, those reports I mentioned earlier really get into it. So what I want to do now is dive into the 4 types of regulations. And there's a lot of terms that are being used in EHS training, EHS manuals, amongst the regulators themselves, amongst companies. We hear about things like performance-based regulations. And these terms are often used in different ways, and the ambiguity is contributing to a lot of confusion about what is the nature of the regulation, what's the intent of the regulator, and how do we comply. And the reports that I mentioned earlier and that we're talking about today, what they do is they reframe the types of regulations into these 4 boxes. So we have an axis that's from ends to means. So ends would be like an objective, and means is a tool or a specific action. Micro being very small level, very specific, and macro being much higher level. And what they propose is to put the regulations into these 4 boxes. So instead of thinking of performance-based regulations, we need to think of them as micro being very targeted and either going at the ends. So think of air emissions limits on stacks or on tailpipes, or the means. And the means, micro means, are the regulations we're most familiar with, where they're specifying the diameter of a pipe, they're specifying the type of valve, things like that. So very prescriptive would be micro means. Macro ends, you're aiming for a large scale change in an industry or other things, and we'll go into this in a bit of detail. And then macro means, those would be that management system approach. So it's macro in the sense that it's large. You're saying you have to have a management system. This covers your entire operation, but it is still means oriented. It's the tool. So you're specifying that a company needs to have a specific thing, a management system in this case, but it's high level, it's macro. So let's just kind of repeat what I just said, but in a different way. So the ends is all about the regulation commanding the avoidance of some ends. So it's smokestack emissions, tailpipe emissions, wastewater emissions. These would be classic examples of legislating or regulating the end, the objective. Means, again, is going after a specific action or a specific means, a specific tool that you can use. It could be a mechanical tool, a part, or other things. Micro, so regulations targeting individual components of a larger problem. So if you have a whole process, you might have a micro regulation or regulation that's micro in nature and that's specifying a specific part of that process that needs to be done in a certain way. And then macro is regulation directs attention to the larger problem itself. So we can think of electric vehicle regulations at a macro level where governments are trying to incentivize both the manufacturers as well as consumers to move towards electric vehicles. So means versus ends. Let's dive into this in a little bit more detail. Means is all about focusing on actions. It's, for example, installing a particular type of valve, retaining certain documents, conducting certain observations. So it's about actions that you need to take, and it's very specific on those actions. Ends is focusing on avoidance. So we're trying to avoid worker injury, we're trying to avoid environmental damage, we're trying to avoid product quality issues. And examples of this would be a building needs to be evacuated in a given amount of time, a ship needs to have a certain amount of have lifeboats that can carry a certain amount of people, a factory must keep its emissions below a certain level. And then we can combine these two. So that's what we're going to get into, is none of these are used in isolation, it's all combined. But I want us to reframe the organization of regulations along these macro and micro and means and ends. So actions and avoidance, for example, the use of protective equipment. Now that means you're specifying the tool, which is the protective equipment, but you can also specify that it has to pass certain testing standards for fire and impact resistance. So you're applying an ends to the protective equipment. You're saying this equipment needs to meet certain objective results in terms of resistance to fire and impact, but you're specifying the means in terms of using the equipment to companies. So we can combine these two. And this will come back as we dive into more detail. Let's compare micro and macro. So micro is focusing on the component of a problem. One that we should all be familiar with are traffic safety regulations. So there we're regulating, red lights, stop signs, lines on the pavement, all sorts of very, very micro things that help us ensure that traffic safety is as safe as possible. So you're focusing on one component of a much larger problem, which would be traffic safety, but you're going to focus on stop signs and red lights and things like that. So macro is focusing on the problem as a whole. Fuel economy regulations is a good example. Electric vehicles, we can think about SO2 trading schemes for sulfur dioxide, trading schemes for carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases. So that's macro. It's focusing on the problem as a whole and not necessarily targeting a very specific component of it. So let's compare a little bit the designs that we've been discussing. Now, if we put it in this sort of this grid, four cell table. Let's go from top left over to the bottom right. So you have micro means. These are those prescriptive ones. You can think of design standards from different institutions such as API, CSA, NFPA, so very specific, often technology based. So you're specifying the technology that needs to be used, the weld type that needs to be used, things like that. And it's very much specifications. It's technical. It's easy to audit, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But it's like a checklist. You got to do this, this, and this, and it's fairly clear and straightforward. Micro ends, so those are those performance-based. When we use the word performance-based, in general, it goes into micro ends, though not exclusively. And it's output-based, so you're trying to regulate the output of a process or a system, and it can be market-based as well. Macro ends, so these are everything from tort and liability, so we can think of the use of criminal liability for directors to potential fines and penalties. Also, general duty provisions in terms of assuring a safe work environment and protecting the environment, and outcome-based regulations. Again, if we think about an industry that they're trying to shift, for example, that electric car example, that's a macro ends. The government wants more electric cars on the roads, and they're going to regulate at a very high level. And then macro means. So these are the management systems that governments are asking us to implement. It can also be performance-based. So that's why we see the word performance-based in both macro means and micro ends. And that's what's creating some of the confusion in the industry, where I say performance-based and I mean one thing, and you say performance-based and you mean something completely different. But by reframing macro means this way, I think it helps us communicate about EHS regulations and regulations in general. So goal-based, it can be a systematic regulation, safety case regulation, or enforced self-regulation. So we can see industry often will develop macro means based regulations where they give guidance, they give standards that companies are going to try to achieve. But it's at a high level, but they will specify the tool that's being used, the means that's being used. And so the report that we're reviewing today, the Regulating High Hazard Industry report, there was a consortium of different people from different industries that came together to kind of develop this framework for looking at regulations. And I found it quite interesting to reframe the regulatory body in this way and move away from terms like performance-based or objective or things like that, and talk about micro means, micro ends, and macro ends. So if we look at some like concrete specific examples here, just to try and solidify this concept in our mind, micro means is installing a hazard warning system that has a certain color scheme. You're saying the hazard warning system has to, flash red or yellow, has to make a certain amount of noise. So that's very specific, very, very clear. Fire extinguisher systems will be similar, particular type of valve. I won't go through everything on this slide. You can look at the slides later and share it with your colleagues. But those micro means, very prescriptive, not a lot of room for interpretation. Micro ends, so ensure that an electrical component of a product passes a test for shock resistance, limit sulfur dioxide emissions. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but it's those regulating the ends, regulating the output, and then allowing the companies to figure out how to get there. Macro ends, so keeping the workplace free of recognized hazards. So there we're specifying the end, which is keeping it free of recognized hazards, but we're staying at a high level. We're not specifying how you do it. We're just specifying that you should be doing this general move towards getting rid of as much recognized hazards as possible. Design and maintain a facility to prevent releases of hazardous substances. Again, that's very high level, open to a lot of room for interpretation in terms of how you achieve that as macro ends. Macro means would be to engage in threat and risk analysis. So you're specifying the tool, which is the analysis of threats and risks, but it's high level. You're not specifying exactly how to do it. Establish and execute a safety management program. Again, it's high level, but you're specifying the means. And there's lots and lots of other examples like this that I'm sure everybody on the call here can think of some regulations that they're dealing with and where they fit within these boxes. And of course, one regulation it won't necessarily be entirely micromeans or entirely macromeans. You can have a regulation that mixes all four of these. So let's talk a little bit about the benefits and disadvantages of each of these four types. So I'll go through each four and we'll talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages. Micromeans, advantage obviously is that it provides clear instructions for the regulated party. It's very specific, not a lot of room for interpretation, and it's easy to verify compliance. It doesn't take a degree in nuclear science to check whether or not you're using the right valve. I mean, that's something that a low-level auditor or a new auditor could come in. They look at the valve that needs to be there. Do you have that valve? Yes, great. No, okay, you've got a problem. So these are easy to audit. They're easy to comply with in many ways, but they do have disadvantages. So it's removing the action from the ultimate concern. You're saying you got to have this type of valve. Well, the ultimate concern is maybe a leak or a pressure buildup, but it is detached from that ultimate concern because you're dealing with just one specific part of a larger process. And then it reduces the flexibility for the industry to comply with the regulations. There might be better technology out there. There might be a new type of valve. There might be a new type of emissions control system that would be more cost effective for your company, that maybe would perform better, that would have a higher safety rating. But the regulation says you got to comply, you got to have this specific type of equipment. And if you don't, you're in trouble. So it reduces the flexibility of industry to comply with these regulations. So that's definitely a disadvantage. And as we know, technology is accelerating, the development of technology is getting faster and faster and faster. And governments aren't known for being the fastest institutions to change. So often you'll have regulations that are written, and by the time they get published and adopted by the regulator, they're already outdated. The technology they're prescribing is already no longer the best available technology on the market. So the speed of technological development makes these micromeans, these prescriptive regulations, even more challenging to use. Micro ends. All right. So again, micro ends is what some people would call performance-based regulations. So it's closer to the concern. If we're regulating the air emissions off of a stack, really our goal is to reduce the air emissions or specific types of air emissions, greenhouse gases, SO2, others, or particulate matter. So it's closer to the ultimate concern. It's easier to communicate, hey, we got to get our emissions down below a certain level. It allows flexibility for the regulated industry. If I'm saying just your emissions need to be, below a certain concentration, it's up to you to figure out how to do that. And you can choose the tools, the methods, the production methodology that's going to help you get there. So it allows a lot more flexibility for the regulated industry. And that's why we see people advocating for systems with trading mechanisms, which is a bit macro, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But at least it creates that flexibility in industry. If industry is good at anything, it's at finding the best solution to their problems. And often government shouldn't be there to tell you how to solve a problem. So this type of regulation gives you that flexibility. But a firm's attainment of the required ends can be difficult to monitor. We can think of a large mining operation that has particulate matter emissions, an open pit mining operation has particulate matter emissions over a very large area. So you don't have a single point of emissions, and then monitoring for compliance is very challenging because you either have to invest a tremendous amount in monitoring equipment and maintenance of that monitoring equipment, or you need to have a lot of staff, and then it's difficult to determine whether or not you're really complying, and that can lead to all sorts of other problems. So monitoring a firm's attainment of the required ends can be difficult. The other downside to this, I would say, is you can create that famous effect of forcing people to teach to the test. We see this in schools where if you have micro ends, we want to have so many kids at this level of graduation or these grades, you end up teaching people how to pass the test. And that can lead to kind of rigging the system. We can think of Volkswagen and the way they cheated the tail pipe emissions regulations. So there was a micro ends based regulation that was implemented by the EPA, and then Volkswagen found, well, they just genuinely cheated, but other companies find these tricky ways to pass the test, but they're not necessarily solving the underlying problem, or they're not respecting the intent of the regulator. All right, macro means management-based systems. So this management systems that we're all familiar with, whether it's ISO or other types of management systems, offers flexibility to the regulated entity. You build your management system for your operations. It's built around your risks, around your people, around your teams. It's easy for the regulators to develop. It's very easy to say, you need to have a robust environmental health safety management system in place. You need to have robust risk and hazard analysis. That's easy to say. It's a heck of a lot harder to actually do and implement. So this is easy for the regulators, and maybe that's why we're seeing more of it. And also it helps infuse a greater sense of responsibility into firms. If we look at the rates of adhesion to management-based systems in certain countries, you will see that it does lead to a greater sense of responsibility in firms. It forces you to analyze your own operations, question the way you're doing things, train people. So there's definitely a benefit there. But the downsides is that a lot of regulatory agencies don't have the expertise to review firm-specific management plans, and regulators often can't pay the salaries that are competitive to attract highly qualified management system auditors. We see this in particular industries such as oil and gas, where the private industry is just too well paid, and the regulators are only able to hire more junior level auditors, and they can't do proper audits of management-based systems. So that's definitely a problem. And some governments have tried to address this by forcing companies to bring in private contractors to assess their management system compliance or conformance. But it's a problem that remains, that regulators often don't have the expertise or the budget to audit management-based systems thoroughly and properly. And on the industry side, firms will often need to hire new personnel with new skills to conduct risk analysis and implement management systems. The skill set it takes to ensure that you're using the right valve, the right personal protective equipment, is a very different skill set than the management system skill set, which requires you to deal with people and systems and have a more holistic view of an operation. So firms themselves struggle to hire, train, and retain the people that allow you to operate a management system properly. And this is especially acute in smaller companies. So large organizations tend to have the budget and the organizational maturity to have a management system that is robust and well respected. That's not exclusively true, but in general. Whereas smaller firms don't have the budget or the organizational maturity to implement robust management systems. And I can think of just one company that we were working with in the Boston area that had been started by some science, PhD people coming out of university. They developed a new process, and it was a fairly high risk process dealing with various materials that were explosive in nature. And their knowledge and conception of a management system was very limited. They were technicians, they were engineers, they were very competent people, very highly educated people, but their understanding of why it's important to have a management system and how do you make a management system run was very limited. And that led to a lot of worker safety issues and high risk situations. So that transition away from a small kind of research-based operation to a larger, more mature operation is not an easy transition at all. It takes the right people, it takes resources, and that's one of the challenges with these macro means-based systems. All right, macro ends. Again, macro ends, you're focusing on the ultimate ends. If we think about getting rid of acid rain in the 1990s, you're focusing on reducing SO2 emissions and getting the acid rain away, or stopping acid rain is a problem. And then, but often, so that's a specific example, but you can think of other situations where we've increased fines and penalties and criminal liability. But I think one of the disadvantages here is that humans are naturally optimistic. We always tend to give ourselves, especially ourselves, the benefit of the doubt. And so firms, companies often underestimate their liability. How much risk do they really have? What is the chances of a catastrophic incident? And we can think of lots of examples, whether it's Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico, whether it's other examples around the world. So we often tend to underestimate our liability. And in cases where harm by noncompliance can be catastrophic, penalties aren't necessarily enough of a tool to dissuade companies. And last month we did a webinar on comprehensive compliance approach, and we discussed the Lac-Mégantic train explosion. And this train explosion killed 47 people, spilled 5 million gallons of oil, and the company that was primarily responsible for it went bankrupt. And so the accident happened, and then the company went bankrupt. So the penalties and the consequences of this weren't enough to force the organization to put in place a robust safety management system and assure compliance. So macro ends can work, but they certainly cannot be used alone on their own. Great, so we've covered now macro means, micro means, macro ends, and micro ends. And I hope this helps reframe a little bit the way regulations are designed. And I want to do a very short case study on the Canadian pipeline industry, partially because it's covered in the reports, but also because we do a lot of work at Mnemonic with the pipeline industry. And Canada, despite its small population, it does have a large area. And so there are over 500,000 miles of pipelines in Canada. 455,000 of them are within provincial boundaries, so they're only regulated by the provinces, but there are 45,000 miles of federally regulated pipelines in Canada. And this distributes a tremendous amount of oil and gas across the country. And this consists of everything from bringing oil, from downstream operations from upstream operations to downstream operations, I should say. What are the main regulators in Canada? So you have the National Energy Board, which is a federal regulator for pipelines, and they only regulate pipelines that either cross provincial or international borders, so into the United States, or across provinces within Canada. It's an independent agency. It's responsible for the entire life cycle of a pipeline, everything from planning and construction to decommissioning. And it relies to a significant degree on the Canadian Standards Association. So this association is an independent association that's nonprofit, and they've developed an overarching standard for oil and gas pipelines called Z662 or Z662 if you're in the US. And it consists of a joint committee composed of federal and provincial regulatory authorities. So the NEB interacts heavily with the CSA, Canadian Standards Association. And the NEB also has moved away from micro means-based regulations to more macro. They started forcing organizations to put in place a safety management system in 1999, and that has become more and more robust and more demanding over the years. And now there's really a requirement to have an overarching integrated management system for all pipelines that cross borders. And not only does the federal government rely on the CSA, but provinces do as well. So in contrast to the United States, Canada, the provincial and federal government are, in theory, regulating on different issues. We're not regulating on the same issue. Whereas in the US, you can have a state that can take a federal regulation and go beyond it. In Canada, in theory, provinces have a certain domain that they regulate on, and the federal government has a certain domain it regulates on, and they shouldn't cross over. There are nuances, of course, in there, but generally speaking, the provinces regulate on a whole set of issues that are specific to provincial jurisdiction. And they also rely on the CSA. So instead of the government developing these standards, they point to the CSA standards, and that has cost benefits for the government, but it adds complexity for compliance. So some of the enforcement challenges in Canada is these same ones that we've discussed earlier, is that micro level requirements are easily understood by staff and agency inspectors, but are limited. They don't solve the overall problem. And some of the catastrophic events that happened in Canada are what led to the implementation of these more macro means, the management system approach. And because we feel, or I say we, really the National Energy Board feels that they help drive safety improvements, but they can leave gaps between what the regulator is expecting and the operator's deliverables. And some of the pipeline companies we've worked with have really struggled to understand what the NEB wanted them to do exactly, because the request was potentially, a little bit vague. For example, one request in a regulation was that they have an assessment of all of their regulatory requirements done, but the interpretation of what is a regulatory requirement was not clear either by the industry or by the regulator. And so when it came time to do audits, the NEB would come in and they would do their audit and they would say, well, actually, we think a regulatory requirement is the sort of individual sentence within a larger paragraph. And so they forced the companies to go to a deeper and deeper level of analysis of the regulations. And this was something that actually evolved over time. The first few audits that the NEB did, they weren't going to that level of detail. But as they saw more operations, as they did more audits, they changed the measurement. So because the regulation is written in a fairly high level, vague way, the NEB has a lot more room for interpretation. And the yardstick, the measuring stick for industry keeps changing. And that can be very frustrating for industry. But it is a reality, one of the enforcement challenges here. And as we discussed earlier, macro means requires intense training for both the operator and the agency. So there's a lot of training that needs to happen to get people to really wrap their heads around what is a management system, what is a well-functioning management system, how do you audit it? And the effectiveness of macro means is still a bit of an open question. It's hard, as we discussed earlier, when you only have periodic catastrophes, which is a good thing, don't get me wrong. Determining the effectiveness of a macro means tool such as a safety and environmental management system is not so easy. With more data and more time, we'll probably have a better way of assessing the effectiveness, but for now it's a little bit tricky. And we're just wrapping up, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but just a kind of summary, the current situations. So regulators are using a combination of micro and macro means-based regulations. There's certainly no regulator in the world that's doing only one of these 4 types of regulations. Almost everybody is doing all 4 at different times in different ways, but it is a hodgepodge of these different 4 types, because we all know that micro level alone is insufficient. And it's also impossible to implement. You can't possibly specify all the individual actions that all companies should take. There's an infinite number of organizations with an infinitely number of ways of organizing their operations. So micro level alone is not enough. But macro means there's still a large knowledge gap in terms of what inspectors know, and also internal staff. As we discussed earlier, small operators, small companies don't have the skills or the maturity or the means, the resources to really comply with macro means regulations. And a small story about that. When Mnemonic, we acquired a company in China two years ago, and this company in China had been set up about 10 years ago to help Chinese businesses ensure that they were respecting Chinese regulations. And the way they went about doing their market study was they looked at the number of ISO 14001 and ISO 45001 certified companies in China. And they saw a huge number. It was like hundreds of thousands of companies are certified to ISO 14001. So therefore, we have a huge market opportunity to sell a regulatory compliance tool. And what they realized once they got to China and once they started building the company was that all these companies may be certified to ISO 40001, but only a very small percentage were actually using the system, actually respecting the system, and actually understanding the system. So it's one thing to be certified, it's one thing to say you have a management system, it's a whole nother thing to actually operate and leverage it to improve your operations. So it took them a lot longer to build up the business that we then acquired, because the numbers of ISO certified companies was not reflective of the actual ISO certified companies in terms of being certified and really understanding and using the system. And another challenge is that regulators will issue prescriptive guidance documents to help firms with specific elements of an integrated management system. So you can't just look at the regulations anymore. You got to be looking at the guidance documents. And even though they're not regulations, if you don't read the guidance documents, often you don't know how the regulators are interpreting their macro their macro means based regulations. And like we discussed earlier, effectiveness of macro means is challenging due to the rarity of events. And the rationale for macro means is often difficult to explain to the public. When there's an accident, when there's a catastrophe, it's easy to say, oh, we're going to force all trains to have this type of tank, with more protection. Or if we can think of the Exxon Valdez catastrophe, where they forced the industry to go to double hull tanks. Well, that's fairly easy to communicate to the public. You say, here's a problem, here's a solution. When you're saying, well, here's the problem, and we're going to force all companies to have a management system, that goes over the head and in one ear and out the ear of the public. And so communicating the value of management systems to the public, in addition to the industry, is a lot more challenging than communicating a very simple or straightforward prescriptive requirement such as double hull tanks on certain types of ships. And that's really the current situation. And I think we're going to see this continue to evolve. We're going to see regulators use these 4 approaches, and it'll be interesting to see how this changes over time. I hope this was helpful for as many people as possible. We're keen to take your questions. And very briefly about Mnemonic, we're about a little over 10 years old. It goes real quick. We improve the world by helping companies respect EHS and quality requirements. And as we just learned, it's not so easy to comply to all of this stuff. It's changing all the time. We have an office here in Montreal and in Shanghai, and we offer solutions for global regulatory coverage, updates, monitoring, audit protocols, and we got some really fantastic software that simplifies your life in terms of organizing this data and linking it to your operations and keeping up to date and keeping the right people informed, and then doing audits out in the field on your mobile devices. So if you're interested in learning more about our tools, definitely give us a call. Happy to chat. And then we have this approach for 7 steps to comprehensive compliance. We did a webinar on this last month. If you're interested, ask us in the post-webinar survey, and we'll send you a copy. But basically, we have a framework that we use to work through the compliance challenges at companies in all industries. We work with everybody. We love everybody. We want to work with everybody. So we have a robust framework that's going to help you reduce your risk, reduce your liability, and try and tame the compliance beats. Try and get a comprehensive compliance program going at your company so that you have less headaches, that you have less risk, less worker injury, and train your staff appropriately. So keen to take any questions. If you have any, please pop them into the chat on the right-hand side. And you can obviously contact us by telephone or by email. And we would be very excited to speak with anybody who is challenged with meeting some of their regulations and wants to make sure their company has a comprehensive compliance program. So great, I'll send this over to Jessica. Thank you so much for attending and for your time. And I look forward to your questions. I look forward to exchanging with you in the future.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for the excellent session on the 4 key types of regulations. I hope all of you found the information useful, and I hope it will help you better understand and meet your compliance obligations. I see some of you clicking on the hand tool. Please send me your questions. Don't raise the hand because that would indicate that I have to unmute you, but it's better if you can just send me your question from the chat box. Also, if you're not staying, I see just a few people leaving. If you're not staying for the question and answer session, please to complete the post-webinar survey. If you want the webinar slides in an email, you can also mention that in the post-webinar survey. And that said, we will start taking questions. So I have the first question, Jonathan. It says, with the trend towards more macro regulations, what is the first step organizations should take to get ready?
I think that's a good question. Let me put on my webcam here so people can see me. I'd say if I had to summarize it, it'd be like training. Understanding managed systems, understanding why they exist, what are the challenges involved in getting them to operate properly it's one of these things. Management systems are like a bit abstract, and when you first present them to people, it's really tough to wrap your head around it. So training and implementing and making sure that you have a system in place to continuously improve your management system. It's not enough anymore to just put it in place and get certified. You have to actually operate the management system, and that takes really strong leadership. Your leadership team needs to understand the value of a management system and needs to believe that the management system will make their company a better place. We see too many companies consider management systems to be simply paperwork. Oh, we need to do this for our ISO certification. But really, if you can get your staff to understand the value and understand the nuances of operating a management system, I think that will bring tremendous benefits to your organization. So training is really critical.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Next question is how to ensure your management systems and controls capture all these types of regulations.
Yeah, I mean, that's it's a big challenge because there's a moving target, right? I mean, both your operations are changing as well as the regulations. So you're kind of trying to hit a dartboard that's moving on you while you're also simultaneously moving. I'd say, if we go back, let me just go back to this slide, to this comprehensive compliance approach. You got to take an approach, and this is plan, do, check, act. So it's very familiar to anybody who's worked in management systems, but you got to have a robust approach that is circular, where you're circling back and reassessing your operations, reassessing the regulatory body on a regular basis. Because if you just do it once and then kind of put it on a shelf or put it in a Excel file or even in a piece of software, that's not going to work long term. And we've seen so many companies that build something that looked beautiful in Excel or in some software, but then they didn't maintain it. So you got to have that knowledge of management systems and have a robust process to keep reevaluating your operations as they change, and doing audits, doing inspections, continuously improving. It's not easy. If it were easy, everybody would do it. But the best companies in the world, the ones that have the least amount of accidents, the least amount of incidents, are the ones that put in place robust management systems. If you can look at ExxonMobil after Exxon Valdez, they went from being, not taking management systems seriously to now being probably one of the best run from an EHS point of view companies in the world. And we can contrast that with other companies that didn't take that route, such as British Petroleum, or Vale. Hopefully there's no BP or Vale people on the call today. But those companies have had catastrophic incidents in the last few years. And I would argue that a lot of it has to do with a lack of a management system approach at their organizations.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. From a software point of view, should you start with micro-mean solutions or with macro-means or something else entirely?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't think there's an easy answer to that. It really depends on your organization, the environment you work in, and what you're trying to achieve. What's interesting is we see in North America more companies, it seems, and this is anecdotal, I don't have data on it, but it seems like more companies move towards an EHS management software platform versus European companies, which European companies seem to purchase point solutions for regulatory compliance, for incident management, things like that, but they don't buy an overall comprehensive package. And I think that has a little bit to do with the maturity that in Europe, the level of certification is much higher, certainly adjusted for GDP and population. And so management systems, I would argue, are taken much more seriously in Europe than they are in North America. But I'd say if you can get, at the end of the day, compliance to regulations and to your own internal standards is probably the first step. If you're not complying to regulations into your own internal standards, I mean, that's the base. That's the base of a management system. So I would argue that you should focus on that first, really get a good grasp of the regulations. And if you look at high hazard industries, the nuclear industry, they were amongst the first to say it's all about the requirements. I mean, at the end of the day, are you complying to the requirements, and making sure you're complying to the right requirements on an ongoing basis? And so purchasing a software tool for that might be the best first way to go, rather than purchasing something that's massive, large, but you don't necessarily have the maturity or the resources to fully utilize its potential. Don't get caught up with the bells and whistles of something. I mean, you can start with Excel and build a list of regulation requirements, and then do audits every month. And you can do all of that in Excel. You don't need to buy software. But building up that organizational maturity is really where I would argue you need to start.
Right. What do you think the lead time is for implementing basic compliance training, as it never seems to be absorbed by many people?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one of these, like, culture things that, how do you change the culture of an organization? That's really tough. It's going to vary a lot based on where you're starting from. How trained are people? Are they coming in fresh, or have they already done training? How big is the organization? What is your organizational structure in terms of who's reporting to whom? So it's tough. I would say, the 7 steps to comprehensive compliance, when we first set it up with a company, and we're typically working with companies that are a little bit more on the, more mature in terms of management systems and compliance. We plan at least a full day workshop with these companies, and these are companies that are already fairly mature. So if your organization doesn't have a robust, mature EHS team in place, I would say you got to book at least a week of training with the key people to educate them about compliance, why it's important, and what is the value that it's going to bring to your organization. And make sure you get them out of that mindset where they view compliance as paperwork. That's the most dangerous thing, because then you got people just ticking boxes without actually verifying things. And you gotta build an understanding of the value of compliance, and that can take ideally a day, but potentially a week. And then obviously you need to do follow-up and do continuous retraining as new staff come on and as staff shift around their positions.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. It seems like that was the last question. So we still have so many people who stayed for the question and answer session. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time. I would remind you all once again to please fill in the post-webinar survey. We would also like to know your suggestions for future webinars. It really helps. We want to bring more relevant content to you. So it would really help us if you have any suggestions, if you want us to cover any topics for future webinars, please let us know in the post-webinar survey, and please do give us some feedback for today's webinar as well. If you think of any questions later on, please feel free to send us at the email info@mnemonic.com. We'll try our best to answer your questions by email as well.
Great.
And if you want the recording, you can mention that in the post-webinar survey, and we'll send you an email. Otherwise, we're not sending email to just everyone. You can also find all our webinar recordings on our website under the webinar section as well. So that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed today's session, and we'll see you soon at the next webinar. Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Have a safe day.